Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, Foundations. Bryant Rayner stood at the window of his modest apartment, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass. Once the owner of a thriving construction company and a beautiful suburban home, he now lived in a two-bedroom walk-up that smelled perpetually of the Chinese restaurant downstairs. His calloused hands, still bearing the marks of someone who'd worked his way up from nothing, clenched into fists. 3 months had passed since Melody Rayner had filed for divorce. 3 months of sleeping on a pull-out couch, so his children, Liam, 7, and Aubrey, 5, could have the only bedroom. 3 months of Melody's lawyer insisting that Bryant was an unfit father because he couldn't provide the lifestyle they deserved. The irony cut deep. Bryant had built that lifestyle brick by brick over 15 years, only to have it torn away through a perfect storm of betrayal. "Dad," Liam's voice pulled Bryant from his thoughts. "Are we going to be late for school again?" Bryant turned to his son, forcing a smile. "Not today, champion. Get your sister. We're leaving in 5. As the children gathered their backpacks, Bryant slipped the worn photo from his wallet, the 4 of them at Liam's 5th birthday, before everything imploded. Before he discovered that Melody had been sleeping with Levi Preston, his business partner of 10 years. Bryant had met Melody waitressing at a diner near his first construction site. He was 22, working 18-hour days to get his fledgling business off the ground. She was 20, putting herself through business school. They'd fallen hard and fast, marrying within a year. For 13 years, they'd been the perfect team, Bryant handling the building, Melody the books. When Levi came on board as a partner, bringing connections to high-end clients, Bryant thought they were unstoppable. Until 6 months ago, when a fire destroyed their warehouse and equipment worth millions. Insurance denied the claim, citing irregularities. Investigations pointed to arson, though nothing was proven. With contracts unfulfilled and lawsuits mounting, Bryant's company collapsed within weeks. Just as bankruptcy loomed, Melody filed for divorce. "Ready, Dad," Aubrey called, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she ran to him. Kissing the top of her head, Bryant pushed away the darkness. His children were all that mattered now. As he drove them to Melody's sprawling new home, purchased somehow despite their financial ruin, Bryant spotted Levi's Porsche in the driveway. The sight of it parked where his truck once stood made bile rise in his throat. "Mom's friend is here again," Liam muttered, his young face hardening in a way that broke Bryant's heart. "Remember what we talked about," Bryant said quietly. "Be respectful, even when it's hard." What he didn't say. Watch everything. Remember everything. Tell me everything. Because Bryant Rayner wasn't just a father fighting for custody. He was a man collecting evidence, piecing together the truth behind his downfall. And somewhere in that house lay answers. Answers his 7-year-old son had just become his unwitting spy to uncover. Chapter 2, Revelations. 3 weeks of custodial visits had yielded little. Bryant sat at his kitchen table, scribbling notes while his lawyer, Diana Cruz, reviewed financial documents. "They're hiding something," Bryant insisted. "The timeline doesn't add up." 3 weeks before the fire, Melody transferred $50,000 to a personal account I never knew existed. Diana sighed. "Suspicious, yes. Proof of criminal activity, no. Without concrete evidence linking Melody or Levi to the arson." "I know my wife," Bryant interrupted. "She calculated every move since college." This wasn't impulsive. Diana leaned forward. "Bryant, the custody hearing is in 2 weeks. Judge Moretti has a reputation for traditional values. If we can't prove Melody's living situation is harmful to the children, she's living with my ex-business partner while still legally married to me. That's not harmful. In today's courts?" "Barely raises an eyebrow," Diana replied. "We need more than moral indignation. Without financial stability on your side." Bryant's phone rang, Melody's number. Answering on speaker, he kept his voice neutral. "Liam's running a fever," Melody said without preamble. "I have an important dinner with Levi's investors. Can you take them tonight?" Bryant caught Diana's eye, who nodded vigorously. "I'll be there in 20 minutes," he replied, then hung up. "Perfect opportunity," Diana said. "The children will be more talkative when they're away from her influence." Brian already had his keys. "Text me if you find anything else in those statements." When Brian arrived, Melody barely acknowledged him, rushing past in a cocktail dress that probably cost a month of his rent. Levi stood in the background, watching Bryant with barely concealed contempt. "They've both eaten," Melody said, slipping on diamond earrings Bryant had never seen before. "Liam's medicine is in his backpack. I'll pick them up after school tomorrow." "I'll take them to school," Brian offered. Melody pursed her lips. "Fine, but don't be late again. It reflects poorly on me, I know," Bryant finished. "Your lawyer has made that abundantly clear." Later that night, with Aubrey asleep and Liam drowsy from medicine, Bryant sat on the edge of his son's bed. "How are things at Mom's house, buddy?" he asked casually, smoothing Liam's hair. Liam yawned. "Okay, I guess. She and Mr. Preston argue sometimes when they think we're asleep." "About what?" "Money stuff. And someone named Russo. Mom said he's getting impatient." Bryant kept his expression neutral despite his racing pulse. Vincent Russo was a developer with rumored mob connections, someone Levi had courted as a client before Bryant vetoed the partnership. "Anything else?" Liam hesitated. "Mom has a special safe in her closet. I saw her put papers in it yesterday. She said if I ever told anyone about it, I'd never see you again." Bryant's blood ran cold. "Did you see what the papers were?" Liam shook his head, eyes drooping. "No, but she types a code to open it. 2-5-8-4. Bryant kissed his son's forehead. "You're a good kid, Liam. Get some sleep now." After Liam drifted off, Bryant called Diana. "I need you to find everything you can on Vincent Russo," he said quietly. "And I think I know where to find her smoking gun." Chapter 3. Infiltration. The weekend custody arrangement gave Bryant 16 hours to execute his plan. He dropped the children at his parents' farm outside the city, then met with a former employee who now worked security. "Standard biometrics safe," Mason said, examining the photos Bryant had taken during a bathroom break at Melody's house. "If you have the code, you're halfway there. But these newer models often have a secondary fingerprint scan. Can it be bypassed?" Mason hesitated. "Technically, yes, but we're talking felony breaking and entering." Bryant's expression darkened. "They already took everything else. What's left to lose?" Late that night, Bryant parked 3 blocks from Melody's house and approached through the wooded area behind the property. Levi's Porsche was gone, at a charity gala, according to Melody's social media. The house was dark except for the porch light. Using the key he'd secretly duplicated from Liam's backpack, Bryant entered through the side door. The alarm panel blinked red. Armed, Bryant punched in the code that had been their anniversary date, holding his breath. The light turned green. Some things never change, he thought grimly. Moving silently through the house, Bryant found the master bedroom, still furnished with pieces he'd handcrafted for their 10th anniversary. The walk-in closet was bigger than his current bedroom, Melody's designer clothes organized meticulously. The safe was hidden behind a panel of shoes. Bryant entered 2-5-8-4, his heart pounding. The digital display flashed green, then prompted for a fingerprint. Bryant pulled out a plastic bag containing a water glass Melody had used during their last custody exchange. Mason had lifted the print and created a silicone replica. Bryant pressed it against the scanner. Access granted. Inside were financial documents, property deeds, and a manila envelope labeled contingency. Bryant photographed everything methodically, his hands steady despite the adrenaline. The last document made his blood run cold. A handwritten agreement between Melody and Levi dated 8 months ago, outlining a plan to eliminate Bryant from the equation and secure company assets before liquidation. Attached was a life insurance policy on Bryant that Melody had taken out without his knowledge. Most damning was a USB drive. Bryant plugged it into his phone with an adapter, finding audio recordings of Melody and Levi discussing the warehouse fire in explicit detail, including their arrangement with an arsonist. "We'll be set once the insurance pays out," Melody's voice said. "If they investigate too deeply, everything points to Bryant cutting corners. And if he figs it out, Levi asked. He won't, Melody replied. But if he does, well, that's what the policy is for. Accidents happen in construction all the time. Bryant's hands trembled as he copied the files. They hadn't just planned to destroy his business. They considered eliminating him permanently. As he carefully replaced everything and resealed the safe, Bryant heard a car in the driveway. Moving swiftly, he exited through the basement window he'd unlocked earlier, disappearing into the darkness as the front door opened. In his car, Bryant called Diana. I've got everything, he said, voice ice cold. All of it. And it's worse than we thought. The hearing is in 4 days, Diana replied. Tell me you didn't break any laws obtaining this evidence. Bryant stared at the house that was once his home, now illuminated by security lights. Let's just say Melody made copies of some very incriminating documents, he answered carefully. And my son found them. Chapter 4. Courtroom Revelation. Judge Evelyn Moretti's courtroom fell silent as Wesley Harmon, Melody's silver-tongued lawyer, delivered his closing argument. Your Honor, the facts speak for themselves, Harmon said, gesturing toward Bryant. Mr. Rayner currently resides in a 2-bedroom apartment in an undesirable neighborhood. He works irregular hours at a construction site and relies on his elderly parents for childcare. Meanwhile, Mrs. Rayner provides a spacious home in an excellent school district with financial stability and consistent routines. Bryant kept his expression neutral, feeling the weight of Liam and Aubrey's future hanging in the balance. Diana Cruz sat beside him, radiating quiet confidence despite Harmon's devastating portrait. Furthermore, Harmon continued, Mr. Rayner's financial collapse raises serious questions about his judgment. The children deserve better than a father who can barely keep a roof over their heads. Judge Moretti's hawkish gaze moved from Harmon to Bryant. Mr. Rayner, do you have anything to add before I deliberate? Bryant started to rise, but Diana placed a restraining hand on his arm. Your Honor, Diana said, standing instead. We've submitted evidence detailing the circumstances of Mr. Rayner's financial situation. As outlined in our brief, there are serious questions about the warehouse fire that destroyed his business. Questions that Mrs. Rayner and her companion, Mr. Preston, have yet to address satisfactorily. Melody shifted uncomfortably while Levi glared from the gallery. Judge Moretti shuffled through papers. I've reviewed your allegations, Ms. Cruz. Without criminal charges, they remain speculative and largely irrelevant to this custody determination. Then perhaps more direct evidence would be pertinent, Diana suggested. We'd like to call a witness. Harmon scoffed. Your Honor, we weren't notified of additional witnesses. This is highly irregular. Who is this witness, Ms. Cruz? Judge Moretti asked. Liam Rayner, Your Honor. The minor child whose custody is at issue. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Moretti frowned. This is unusual, Ms. Cruz. Children's testimony is typically taken in chambers. I understand, Your Honor. However, given the nature of the information, we believe. Absolutely not. Melody interrupted, rising from her seat. I won't allow my son to be manipulated into. Mrs. Rayner, the judge cut in sharply. You'll have your say through counsel. As the adults argued, a small figure stood in the spectators section where Bryant's parents sat with the children. Liam walked determinedly to the gate separating the gallery from the court floor. I want to talk, the 7-year-old announced, his voice silencing the bickering lawyers. I found something important. Judge Moretti's stern expression softened slightly. Young man, this isn't how court procedures work. But it's about the papers in Mom's secret safe, Liam persisted. The ones that say she and Mr. Preston started the fire to hurt Dad's company. The courtroom erupted. Melody went pale, while Levi half rose from his seat before his lawyer yanked him back down. Your Honor, Harmon shouted over the commotion. This is clearly rehearsed testimony. Mr. Rayner has obviously coached the child. Judge Moretti banged her gavel. Order. Everyone sit down. She fixed Melody with a penetrating stare. Mrs. Rayner, do you have a safe in your home? Melody's composure cracked. Of course I do, but that's not. And would your son have knowledge of this safe? He must have been snooping, Melody snapped. Children imagine things. I didn't imagine the recordings, Liam said clearly. I copied them after I saw Mom hide the little computer stick. Bryant hadn't anticipated this. He'd carefully prepared Liam to mention the letter he'd found, the agreement between Melody and Levi, but not the recordings. Somehow, his son had conducted his own intelligence operation. Judge Moretti turned to Liam. Young man, do you have these recordings with you? Liam nodded solemnly, reaching into his pocket and producing a small USB drive, different from the one Bryant had discovered. Grandpa helped me copy it from Mom's computer after I took the other one from her safe. I put that one back like in the spy movies. The courtroom fell silent as the bailiff took the drive and handed it to the judge. Melody's face had drained of all color. Your Honor, Harmon interjected desperately. Whatever that device contains, it was obtained illegally by a minor child. It cannot possibly be admissible. Mr. Harmon, Judge Moretti said coolly, I'll determine admissibility after reviewing the contents. Court is in recess for 1 hour. Mrs. Rayner and Mr. Preston will remain in the building. She fixed them with a steely gaze. I strongly suggest you contact criminal defense attorneys. As the courtroom emptied, Bryant knelt before his son. Liam, why didn't you tell me about the second drive? He asked quietly. The boy's eyes were serious beyond his years. Because Mom said people who knew too much got hurt. I wanted us both to be safe. In that moment, Bryant realized his son hadn't just been a pawn in this game. He'd been a player, watching and calculating just like his father. Chapter 5, Consequences. 1 hour stretched into 3 as Judge Moretti reviewed the evidence in chambers with representatives from the district attorney's office. Bryant waited with the children and his parents in a conference room, while Melody and Levi were sequestered elsewhere with their respective attorneys. Diana entered, her expression cautiously triumphant. They're still reviewing everything, but the recordings are damning, she reported. Melody and Levi discussing not just the arson, but plans to frame you if investigations got too close. There's also evidence they've been systematically draining company accounts for over a year. Bryant absorbed this with cold satisfaction. And custody? Judge Moretti has separated that determination from the criminal matters. But given the circumstances, Diana's smile widened. She's indicated a strong presumption in your favor. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. 2 plainclothes detectives now sat behind the prosecutor's table. Judge Moretti's face was granite as she called the court to order. Based on evidence that has come to light during these proceedings, I am issuing emergency temporary orders, she announced. Full physical and legal custody of Liam and Aubrey Rayner is granted to their father, Bryant Rayner, effective immediately. Bryant exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift from his chest. Furthermore, the judge continued, Mrs. Rayner is to have no contact with the minor children pending criminal investigation into matters revealed today. She turned to the detectives. The court has provided copies of all evidence to law enforcement. You may proceed. The detectives rose. Melody Rayner and Levi Preston, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and arson, one announced. What followed was chaos. Melody screaming that Bryant had set her up, Levi attempting to flee before being tackled by bailiffs, and Harmon desperately trying to negotiate surrender terms. Through it all, Bryant remained seated, one arm around each child, his expression revealing nothing of the savage satisfaction coursing through him. Later, as they prepared to leave the courthouse, Diana pulled Bryant aside. Most men would feel vindicated now, she observed. You don't seem particularly celebratory. Bryant watched his children gathering their things with his parents. This isn't victory, he said quietly. It's just the beginning. Diana studied him. Bryant, you've got custody, and they're facing serious prison time. What more do you want? Bryant's eyes were flat and cold. They planned to kill me, Diana. They destroyed everything I spent 15 years building. They traumatized my children. He buttoned his jacket with deliberate precision. This legal proceeding? It's just round 1. Bryant, Diana warned, whatever you're planning, don't. You've won. Don't throw it away on revenge. Bryant smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm a law-abiding citizen who's been grievously wronged. I'm simply going to ensure justice is fully served. As they left the courthouse, reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Bryant guided his family past them without comment, but paused at the bottom of the steps when one reporter thrust a microphone in his face. "Mr. Rayner, how do you feel about your ex-wife's arrest?" Bryant looked directly into the camera. "Justice is a patient process," he said calmly. "And so am I." Chapter 6. Preparation. 3 months after the courtroom revelation, life had achieved a new normal. Bryant had moved the children to a comfortable 3-bedroom house in a safe neighborhood, using money from the insurance settlement finally paid after the arson investigation cleared him of wrongdoing. His construction business was slowly rebuilding, focusing on smaller projects with reliable clients who had stood by him. The children were in therapy, processing their mother's betrayal and subsequent disappearance from their lives. Melody and Levi had both posted bail, Melody using her parents' retirement savings as collateral, Levi through connections that raised questions among investigators. Their criminal trial was still months away. Bryant sat at his kitchen table late one night, reviewing documents Diana had forwarded from the prosecutor's office. The case against Melody and Levi was strong, but not airtight. Both had hired aggressive defense attorneys who were attempting to paint Bryant as the mastermind who framed them after his business failed. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, "Shipping warehouse on Fletcher St. Midnight. Information about Preston you'll want. Come alone." Bryant stared at the message. It could be a trap, yet his instincts told him otherwise. He called his parents to check on the sleeping children, then drove to the industrial district. The warehouse was dark except for a single light near the loading dock. Bryant approached cautiously, one hand on the legal handgun he now carried. "That won't be necessary," came a voice from the shadows. A man stepped into the light, tall, immaculately dressed, with silver temples and cold eyes. "Vincent Russo. We have mutual acquaintances." Bryant didn't lower his guard. The developer Levi was courting, the one with certain connections. Russo smiled thinly. "I prefer to think of myself as a businessman with diverse interests. Your former partner approached me about financing some projects after your company's unfortunate accident. Why contact me now?" Professional courtesy. Preston has been making promises using assets he doesn't control. He's assured certain investors that once his legal troubles are resolved, he'll have access to your insurance settlement and business contracts. Bryant's jaw tightened. He'll be disappointed. Yes, well, disappointment can be dangerous in my circles. Russo handed Bryant a flash drive. "Consider this insurance." Preston's been recording his conversations, including with his attorney. Apparently, he doesn't fully trust his paramour either. Bryant pocketed the drive. "Why give me this? Let's just say I prefer dealing with men who honor their commitments. Preston is a liability. You are always the one with actual talent." Russo turned to leave. "Oh, and Bryant? They're planning to offer testimony against each other. Neither is particularly loyal under pressure." After Russo departed, Bryant reviewed the files at home. The recordings confirmed his suspicions. Melody and Levi were already plotting against each other, each planning to claim the other was the mastermind. More valuable were their current schemes. Levi had hidden assets offshore that prosecutors hadn't discovered, while Melody had been contacting relatives about fleeing to a non-extradition country if things went south. Bryant created copies of everything before calling Diana. "I need you to pass something to the prosecutor anonymously," he explained. "And then I need your help with something else, something not strictly legal." Bryant, "They were going to kill me, Diana, and now they're planning to run. The system won't deliver true justice." Silence stretched between them before Diana sighed. "What do you need?" "Access to their electronic accounts, emails, financials, everything. I know you have contacts who can manage that. And if I get that for you?" Bryant's voice was eerily calm. "Then I ensure they destroy each other more thoroughly than the justice system ever could." The next morning, Bryant met with a man Diana had reluctantly connected him with, a cybersecurity expert named Otis who operated in gray areas of the law. "Everything leaves a digital footprint," Otis explained, setting up untraceable equipment in Bryant's garage. "With account credentials, I can create a comprehensive mirror of their digital lives without detection." "How long?" "Give me a week. Then you'll have everything: emails, texts, financial records, cloud storage. Otis glanced up. Just remember, knowledge is power, but what you do with it determines whether you're the hero or villain of your story. Bryant's expression remained unchanged. In my experience, life isn't that black and white. Over the following weeks, Bryant immersed himself in his enemies' digital lives. He discovered Levi's network of shady investors, evidence of previous fraudulent schemes, and, most critically, his plan to double-cross Melody by planting evidence suggesting she had acted alone. Melody's communications revealed her own betrayal in progress. Secret meetings with prosecutors offering testimony against Levi in exchange for leniency, and plans to sue Bryant for defamation once criminal charges were reduced. Neither suspected they were being watched. Neither realized their weapons were being turned against them. Bryant created a secure email account and contacted each of their attorneys separately, anonymously providing evidence of their clients' planned betrayals. He sent select recordings to Levi's shadier investors, revealing plans to implicate them if necessary. To the prosecutors, he anonymously delivered proof of hidden assets and escape plans. "You're playing a dangerous game," Diana warned during a late-night call. "These people have already proven they're willing to commit arson. What happens when they realize someone's systematically dismantling their defenses?" "They'll suspect each other," Bryant replied. "That's the beauty of it. By the time they realize the truth, it'll be too late." As summer turned to fall, Bryant's plan unfolded with meticulous precision. The growing distrust between Melody and Levi became evident in their increasingly hostile court filings. Their legal teams began withdrawing, citing irreconcilable differences with clients. Bryant watched it all with detached satisfaction, compartmentalizing this dark work from his daytime role as devoted father rebuilding a normal life for his children. The final phase of his plan was ready. All that remained was to spring the trap that would ensure neither Melody nor Levi ever threatened his family again. Chapter 7: Entrapment. The exclusive Riverside restaurant was nearly empty at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, exactly as Bryant had planned. Using one of Melody's email accounts, he'd arranged a meeting with Levi, masquerading as her willing to discuss a unified defense strategy. Through Levi's account, he'd sent a similar invitation to Melody. Neither would know the other was coming until it was too late. Bryant sat in a corner booth with clear sight lines to both entrances, nursing a whiskey and checking his watch. The waitstaff had been generously tipped to ensure privacy and specific seating arrangements. Melody arrived first, her designer outfit unable to hide the stress of recent months. She'd lost weight, and her once perfect makeup couldn't conceal the shadows beneath her eyes. She scanned the restaurant anxiously before the hostess directed her to a booth one over from Bryant's, separated by a privacy partition. 15 minutes later, Levi entered, his trademark confidence notably diminished. His Italian suit hung looser on his frame, and his eyes darted nervously around the space before he was seated at a table positioned where neither he nor Melody could see each other from their respective locations. Bryant activated the recording devices he'd planted earlier that morning, disguised as ordinary personal items left at each table. Then he sent identical text messages from burner phones to both targets, running 10 minutes late. "Order a drink. We need to discuss the offshore accounts." Through carefully placed compact mirrors, Bryant watched the color drain from both their faces. Neither left, the mention of offshore accounts too critical to ignore. Another text to Melody. "I know you're planning to testify against me. Smart move, but dangerous. I still have the original plan in your handwriting." To Levi, "The DA has the recordings. You're the sacrificial lamb unless we coordinate our stories." Russo is getting impatient about his investment. Bryant watched their growing panic with cold satisfaction. After sending a final message to each, "Meet me in the private dining room and back," he slipped out a service entrance. From his car parked across the street, Bryant used a directional microphone to monitor what happened next. Melody and Levi, both expecting to meet their accomplice, instead encountered each other in the private dining room. "What the hell are you doing here?" Levi's voice crackled through Bryant's receiver. "Me? You texted me to come." Melody shot back. I didn't text you anything. You contacted me about offshore accounts. Their confusion quickly escalated to accusations, then to threats, as each believed the other had set them up. If you're wearing a wire for the DA, I swear to God, Levi growled. Me? You're the one threatening to implicate me. I saw your emails to your attorney. What emails? I never. Levi stopped suddenly. Wait, someone's playing us against each other. A moment of silence fell before Melody whispered, Bryant. Bryant smiled as he started his car. By now, they would be discovering the final element of his setup. An envelope he'd left in a private dining room containing copies of their most incriminating communications, along with a note. The originals are with people who will release them if anything happens to me or my children. Your move. The next day, Bryant received separate calls from Melody's and Levi's new attorneys, requesting settlement discussions. They're willing to plead guilty to reduced charges, Diana reported after the meetings. No trial. No risk of you or Liam having to testify. Melody will relinquish all parental rights in exchange for a more lenient sentence. Levi will make full financial restitution. And if I refuse? Bryant asked, though he already knew the answer. Then they go to trial separately, each planning to blame the other. It would be messy, public, and traumatic for the children. Diana studied him. This is a win, Bryant. Take it. Bryant nodded slowly. Set up the paperwork. But add one condition. Neither can ever contact me or my children again. Any violation means immediate release of everything we have. Diana began to speak, then stopped herself. I never asked where all that additional evidence came from. Bryant's smile didn't reach his eyes. Better that way, isn't it? Chapter 8. Collapse. The plea agreements were signed on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Melody received 5 years with possibility of parole after 3 in exchange for relinquishing all parental rights and providing testimony about Levi's wider financial crimes. Levi got 8 years with no possibility of early release, plus full financial restitution to Bryant's business and additional penalties for the investors he defrauded. Bryant attended neither hearing, sending Diana in his place. He spent the day with Liam and Aubrey at the construction site of what would become their new home, a fresh start built by his own hands. Is Mom really going to jail? Aubrey asked as they watched concrete being poured for the foundation. Bryant knelt to her level. Yes, Princess. For a few years. Because she did bad things with Mr. Preston? That's right. Liam, more aware of the complexities, asked the harder question. Will we ever see her again? Bryant looked his son directly in the eyes. That will be your choice when you're older. For now, we're focusing on our new life. That evening, as the children slept, Bryant received a call from an unknown number. He almost declined it before curiosity won out. Bryant Rayner. You've ruined me. Melody's voice, hollow with defeat. Are you satisfied now? Bryant's grip tightened on the phone. You're violating the no-contact order. What difference does it make? You've taken everything. My freedom, my children, my future. You took those things from yourself, Bryant replied coldly. The moment you decided I was disposable. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she whispered. The fire was Levi's idea. Things just escalated, including the life insurance policy. The one where you benefited if I had an accident. Silence stretched between them. I never would have gone through with that part, Melody finally said. Forgive me if I don't believe you. Bryant's voice remained emotionless. You have nothing I want, Melody. Not explanations, not apologies. Nothing. They're my children too, she pleaded. You can't just erase me from their lives. You did that yourself. Goodbye, Melody. Bryant hung up and immediately called Diana. Melody just contacted me directly. Violation of the agreement. Diana sighed. I'll file the motion in the morning. This means the remaining charges can be reinstated. Good, Bryant said simply. The next week brought news that Melody's sentence had been extended to 10 years with no possibility of early parole. Meanwhile, Levi's offshore accounts were frozen after anonymous tips to financial authorities in 3 countries. Vincent Russo appeared at Bryant's construction site unannounced, watching silently as crews erected steel beams for a new commercial project. Impressive recovery, Russo commented when Bryant approached him. Word is you're expanding faster than before. Bryant shrugged. Quality work speaks for itself. Indeed it does, as does the systematic destruction of one's enemies. Russo smiled thinly. Preston's associates are most distressed about their vanished investments. Financial crimes have consequences, Bryant replied neutrally. So, I've observed. Russo handed him a business card. When you're ready for larger projects, call me. I appreciate a man who can be thorough. That night, Bryant burned the card and deleted the final copies of evidence from his secure drives. The originals remained with his attorney, insurance against any future threats. Within a year, Bryant's construction company had not only recovered, but expanded, building a reputation for both quality and integrity. His children were thriving in their new school, the trauma of their mother's betrayal fading under Bryant's steady guidance. Only in private moments did Bryant allow himself to reflect on the calculated destruction he'd engineered, not with regret, but with the cold satisfaction of a man who had protected what was his and punished those who had tried to take it. Chapter 9. Aftermath. 5 years passed. Bryant's construction company had become one of the largest in the state, known for innovative designs and ethical business practices. The children had adjusted well. Liam, now 12, and showing his father's aptitude for building things, Aubrey, 10, and blossoming into a confident young girl with her father's resilience. Bryant had dated occasionally, but kept relationships casual, unwilling to introduce potential disruption into their hard-won stability. His focus remained on his children and his business, the betrayal a closed chapter he rarely discussed. Until the letter arrived. The prison stationery was unmistakable, as was the handwriting. Bryant nearly discarded it unopened, but something, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a desire for final closure, made him break the seal. Bryant, I'm being released next month. 5 years, just as promised. I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, what we lost. The children must be so grown now. Liam would be 12, and Aubrey 10. I know I have no right to ask, but I'd like to see them. Just once. To apologize. To explain that what happened wasn't their fault. They deserve that much, don't they? I'm not the same person who betrayed you. Prison changes you, strips away pretenses. I understand if you hate me forever, but please don't punish them by erasing half their history. Melody. Bryant read the letter twice before calling Diana, now a judge herself. She's really getting out next month? He asked without preamble. Good afternoon to you too, Diana replied dryly. Yes, her release is scheduled. The parole board decided she's been a model prisoner, teaching GED classes, counseling other inmates. Very rehabilitative narrative. And the no-contact order, still in effect regarding you. But regarding the children, Diana paused. Bryant, they're older now. The court might consider allowing supervised visitation if she petitions for it. Bryant's jaw tightened. They haven't asked about her in over 3 years. That doesn't mean they don't think about her. Children are complicated. Diana's voice softened. What are you going to do? That evening, Bryant sat his children down in their comfortable living room. I received a letter from your mother today, he said, watching their faces carefully. She's being released from prison next month. Liam's expression hardened immediately, a mirror of Bryant's own mask. Aubrey looked confused, then curious. She'd like to see you, Bryant continued. That decision is entirely yours. I won't force either of you, and I won't think less of you whatever you decide. I don't want to see her, Liam said immediately. She tried to hurt you. She left us. Bryant nodded, acknowledging his son's loyalty without reinforcing it. Aubrey, the 10-year-old twisted her hands in her lap. I don't really remember her much anymore, she admitted. Just bits and pieces. Would it be bad if I wanted to see what she's like now? No, sweetheart. Not bad at all. Bryant kept his voice neutral despite the conflicting emotions surging through him. The next day, Bryant arranged for a supervised visitation center to manage any potential meeting. He would not be present, could not trust himself to be in the same room as Melody without his carefully constructed control slipping. A week before Melody's release, Bryant received another call, this one from the prison chaplain. Mr. Rayner, I'm afraid I have difficult news. Melody collapsed in the yard yesterday. By the time medical help arrived, she was gone. The preliminary finding is an aneurysm, though the medical examiner is still investigating. Bryant listened in silence, feeling nothing but a hollow emptiness where rage had burned for so long. She asked me to give you a message if anything happened to her, the chaplain continued. She said, tell Bryant he won. Completely. And that I'm sorry. That night, after sharing the news with the children, Aubrey crying, Liam stoic, Bryant sat alone on his deck, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. 5 years of methodical retribution had consumed him, transformed him. He had rebuilt his business, his reputation, his children's security. He had engineered the complete destruction of those who betrayed him. And yet, with Melody's death, he felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the weight of years spent nurturing vengeance when he could have been healing. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Heard about Melody. My condolences. That offshore account she never knew about just cleared regulatory scrutiny. Lunch sometime? Levi. Bryant stared at the message, rage rekindling. Levi had clearly served his reduced sentence and somehow managed to preserve some of his hidden assets. Even now, he was reaching out, assuming their shared history with Melody might forge some twisted bond. For a moment, Bryant considered igniting the cycle again, investigating, accumulating evidence, orchestrating another downfall. Instead, he deleted the message and blocked the number. Some enemies weren't worth the cost of destroying them. Some victories weren't worth the price of winning them. Bryant Rayner had protected what mattered: his children, his business, his future. The rest could burn to ashes, just like the warehouse that had started it all. He would never forgive. He would never forget. But finally, after 5 long years, he would move forward. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Examination. Christopher Buchanan sat in the waiting room of Dr. Ted Ramsey's optometry clinic, scrolling through emails on his phone while his wife Jeanette underwent her annual eye exam. At 42, Chris had learned patience during his 12 years in military intelligence, but the mundane ritual of medical appointments still tested him. His security consulting firm was thriving, and he had 3 potential contracts waiting for his review. The couple had been married for 15 years, ever since Chris left the Army. Jeanette, a freelance graphic designer, had been experiencing mild headaches lately. Nothing serious, but enough to prompt today's visit. Their 2 children, Emma and Jake, were at school, blissfully unaware that this ordinary Tuesday would shatter their world. Chris had chosen Dr. Ramsey's practice because of its reputation and advanced diagnostic equipment. The optometrist was known throughout Denver for his thorough examinations and state-of-the-art retinal imaging technology. What should have been a routine visit was about to become anything but routine. Mr. Buchanan? Dr. Ramsey's voice carried an edge that made Chris look up from his phone. The optometrist stood in the doorway, his face unnaturally pale, hands trembling slightly as he gripped the doorframe. Is everything all right, doctor? Chris rose, immediately sensing something was wrong. His military training had taught him to read people, and Dr. Ramsey looked like a man who had seen something that violated the natural order of things. Could you come back here, please? The optometrist's voice wavered, and he glanced nervously toward the examination rooms. Chris followed Dr. Ramsey down the hallway, noting how the man's shoulders were rigid with tension. They passed the examination room where Jeanette waited, her eyes still dilated from the drops, looking confused at the sudden change in atmosphere. In his office, Dr. Ramsey closed the door and turned to face Chris. The man had been practicing for 15 years, had seen everything from rare genetic conditions to severe injuries, but whatever was on his computer screen had shaken him to his core. Sir, I need you to get your children and leave the city, Dr. Ramsey said, his voice barely above a whisper. Do not go home. What? Chris felt his blood turn to ice. What are you talking about? Dr. Ramsey's hand shook as he turned his monitor toward Chris. It's horrifying. I've never seen this in my 15-year career. On the screen was Jeanette's retinal scan, but embedded within the natural patterns of blood vessels and optic nerve tissue were tiny, geometric structures that definitely didn't belong in human anatomy. They looked almost like circuitry, microscopic, artificial, and clearly foreign. Chris stared at the image, his mind racing. The structures were so small, they were barely visible even with the high-resolution equipment, but they formed a distinct pattern across Jeanette's retina. It looked like some kind of network with interconnected nodes that pulsed faintly with an almost imperceptible light. What the hell is that? Chris's voice was steady, but his military training was already kicking in, analyzing threats and calculating responses. I don't know, Dr. Ramsey whispered, but I've seen something similar once before about 2 years ago. A patient came in with similar structures. 3 days later, she was found dead in her apartment. The police called it a suicide, but he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Chris felt the world shift beneath his feet. Someone had done this to his wife. Someone had implanted something in her eyes without her knowledge or consent. The implications were staggering. How long had they been watching her? What were they planning? Doctor, I need you to copy this scan to a secure drive, Chris said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used when briefing colonels and generals. Then I need you to delete it from your system and forget this conversation ever happened. Dr. Ramsey nodded quickly, his hands still trembling as he began transferring the files. What are you going to do? Whatever it takes to protect my family, Chris replied, already formulating plans. His mind was shifting into operational mode, cataloging resources, identifying potential threats, and calculating the best ways to disappear. 20 minutes later, Chris walked calmly back to the examination room where Jeanette waited. She looked up at him with concern, noting the tension in his posture despite his attempt to appear normal. Everything okay, honey? She asked, squinting slightly as her vision was still adjusting. Just some paperwork issues with the insurance, Chris lied smoothly. Dr. Ramsey needs to reschedule some follow-up tests. We should go. As they left the clinic, Chris was already calculating their next moves. He had to get the children from school without raising suspicion, gather essential supplies, and disappear before whoever was behind this realized their surveillance had been discovered. The secure phone in his pocket contained contact from his military days, people who could help them vanish if necessary. But first, he needed answers. The retinal implants weren't random. They were sophisticated, expensive, and required incredible technological resources to implement. This wasn't the work of common criminals or even typical government surveillance. This was something bigger, more sinister, and far more personal than Chris had initially realized. As they drove toward the elementary school, Chris caught Jeanette looking at him in the rearview mirror. Chris, you're scaring me. What's really going on? He met her eyes in the mirror, seeing the trust and love that had sustained them through 15 years of marriage. I promise I'll explain everything once we're safe. But right now, I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that? She nodded without hesitation, and Chris felt a surge of gratitude for the strength of their partnership. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. But first, he had to get his family to safety and figure out who had violated his wife in such an intimate, technological way. The game had begun, but Chris Buchanan was no ordinary opponent. Chapter 2. The Discovery. The safe house was a cabin Chris had purchased 3 years earlier under a shell corporation, a precaution from his consulting days that was now proving invaluable. Located 40 miles outside Denver in the foothills, it was isolated enough to provide security while maintaining internet connectivity for his investigation. Emma and Jake had been surprisingly adaptable to their sudden camping trip, though 13-year-old Emma was beginning to ask pointed questions about why they couldn't go home. Chris had collected them from school with a story about a gas leak at the house, buying himself time to formulate a longer-term plan. Now, as the children slept in the cabin's loft, Chris sat at his laptop analyzing the retinal scan Dr. Ramsey had provided. Jeanette was beside him, finally learning the truth about what had been discovered in her eyes. So these things, They're watching me? Jeanette's voice was steady, but Chris could see the fear in her eyes. More than watching, Chris replied, manipulating the image to highlight the microscopic structures. These aren't just passive surveillance devices. Look at the pattern. They're networked, which means they can transmit and receive data. Someone has essentially turned your eyes into biological surveillance cameras. Chris had been running the scan through various analysis programs, comparing it to military intelligence databases he still had access to through former contacts. What he'd found was both illuminating and terrifying. The technology level is extraordinary, he continued, pulling up comparative images on his screen. This is beyond anything I've seen in classified military projects. We're talking about nanotechnology that's at least a decade ahead of anything publicly available. Jeanette wrapped her arms around herself. How would they do this to me? When? I've never had any kind of eye surgery. That's what I've been trying to figure out. Chris opened another window on his laptop, displaying a timeline he'd been constructing. I've been going through your medical history, your appointments, anywhere you might have been exposed to this technology. The breakthrough had come when Chris cross-referenced Jeanette's schedule with recent technological patents. 3 months earlier, Jeanette had participated in a focus group for a new virtual reality interface system. The company had been offering substantial compensation for participants willing to test their revolutionary eye-tracking technology. Nexus Dynamics, Chris said, pointing to the company name on his screen. They paid you $800 for a 3-hour session to test their VR system. Do you remember anything unusual about that day? Jeanette thought back, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was pretty standard, actually. They had me wear this headset and look at various images and videos. The only odd thing was that they gave me eye drops beforehand, said it would help with the calibration. Chris felt his jaw tighten. Eye drops. That was the delivery method. They anesthetized your eyes and implanted these devices during the calibration session. But as Chris dug deeper into Nexus Dynamics, he discovered that the company was a front. The real owner, hidden behind layers of shell corporations and offshore accounts, was someone Chris recognized from his military intelligence days, Frederick Moore. Moore was a defense contractor who had made billions developing surveillance technology for various government agencies. 5 years ago, Chris had been part of a military intelligence unit that investigated Moore's company for potential human rights violations in their overseas operations. The investigation had been shut down abruptly, and Chris had always suspected that Moore had powerful friends protecting him. "This son of a bitch," Chris muttered, staring at Moore's photograph on his screen. Frederick Moore was a thin, pale man with cold blue eyes and a perpetual sneer that suggested he viewed other people as lab rats. "You know him?" Jeanette asked, noting the anger in her husband's voice. "Frederick Moore. I encountered him during my military service. He's a defense contractor who specializes in surveillance and psychological warfare technology. He's also completely without conscience when it comes to human experimentation." Chris pulled up Moore's file, revealing a pattern of unethical behavior spanning decades. There were reports of unauthorized drug testing on employees, illegal surveillance of family members of government officials, and suspected involvement in several mysterious deaths of former associates. "But why me?" Jeanette asked. "I'm nobody special. I'm a graphic designer from suburban Denver." Chris had been wondering the same thing until he made another connection. "It's not about you specifically, it's about me. Moore knows who I am, and he knows I was part of the investigation into his operations. You're not his target, you're his way of getting to me." The implications were chilling. Moore had been using Jeanette as an unwitting surveillance device, monitoring their family's activities, conversations, and movements. Every intimate moment, every private discussion, every aspect of their lives had been compromised. "There's something else," Chris said, his voice grim. Dr. Ramsey mentioned that he'd seen this before in a patient who died 3 days later. "I think Moore has been testing this technology on multiple subjects, probably using them to gather intelligence on various targets." Chris began cross-referencing missing persons reports with the locations of Nexus Dynamics focus groups. The pattern was undeniable. People who had participated in these sessions were disappearing or dying under suspicious circumstances. He's been using innocent people as test subjects for his surveillance network, Chris realized. And when they're no longer useful, or when someone gets too close to discovering the truth. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Both he and Jeanette understood the implications. So what do we do? Jeanette asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Chris looked at his wife, seeing the strength and determination that had attracted him to her all those years ago. We can't go to the authorities. Moore has too many connections, and we don't know how deep his influence goes. We can't run forever, either. Eventually, he'll track us down. So we fight back, Jeanette said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Chris nodded, feeling a familiar surge of the tactical mindset that had served him well in military intelligence. We fight back, but we do it smart, and we do it in a way that ensures he can never threaten our family again. As Chris began formulating his plan, he reflected on the resources at his disposal. His security consulting business had put him in contact with various specialists, people who operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal, who had skills that would be invaluable in the coming conflict. Frederick Moore had made a critical error. He had threatened the family of someone who possessed both the skills and the motivation to destroy him completely. The man who had spent years perfecting surveillance and psychological warfare was about to discover what it felt like to be hunted by someone who understood those games better than he did. The war between Christopher Buchanan and Frederick Moore was about to begin, and Chris intended to make sure it ended with Moore's complete and utter destruction. Chapter 3: The History of Enemies. Chris spent the early morning hours in the cabin's basement, which he had converted into a secure communications center during his first year of consulting work. Multiple encrypted hard drives contained files from his military intelligence days, information that officially didn't exist but could prove invaluable in understanding Frederick Moore's operations and psychology. The history between Chris and Moore went back 7 years to a classified operation in Eastern Europe. Chris had been a captain in military intelligence, assigned to investigate reports that Moore's defense contracting company was testing experimental psychological warfare techniques on civilian populations in war-torn regions. The evidence had been damning. Moore's company, operating under the cover of humanitarian aid, had been administering experimental drugs and psychological conditioning techniques to refugees in several camps. The goal was to create a population that could be more easily controlled and manipulated, a testbed for techniques that could later be applied to domestic populations. Chris's investigation had uncovered evidence of hundreds of deaths, psychological torture, and human experimentation that violated every international treaty on human rights. But when he presented his findings to his superiors, the investigation was suddenly classified and buried. Within a month, Chris found himself reassigned to a desk job in Colorado, effectively ending his military career trajectory. What Chris had never known until now was that Moore had been aware of the investigation from the beginning. The defense contractor had files on every member of Chris's team, including detailed psychological profiles and information about their families. Moore had been playing a long game, waiting for the right moment to strike back at the man who had nearly exposed his operations. "He's been watching us for years," Chris muttered, studying surveillance photos that Moore's organization had compiled. The images showed Jeanette at the grocery store, the children at their school, even Chris himself at various client meetings for his consulting business. But Moore had made a mistake in his patience. The years had given Chris time to build his own network of contacts and resources. His security consulting business wasn't just a cover. It was a legitimate operation that had put him in touch with former special operations soldiers, intelligence analysts, private investigators, and other specialists who operated in the shadow world between legal and illegal activities. One of his key assets was Jordan Eastman, a former Army Ranger who now ran a small but highly effective private security firm. Jordan specialized in what he euphemistically called problem resolution, handling situations that required skills and methods that conventional law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't employ. Chris made an encrypted phone call, knowing that Jordan would answer despite the early hour. "Buchanan." Jordan's gravelly voice came through the secure line. "I was wondering when you'd call. Word is you've dropped off the grid. How much do you know?" Chris asked, aware that information traveled fast in their specialized community. Enough to know that Frederick Moore has been asking questions about your family. My sources say he's been unusually active lately, moving money and resources around like he's preparing for something big. Chris felt a chill of confirmation. Moore wasn't just conducting surveillance. He was preparing for the next phase of his plan. I need a full workup on Moore's current operations, Chris said. Personnel, locations, financial structures, everything. And I need it done quietly. What's your timeline? Yesterday, Chris replied. Jordan, this bastard has done something to my wife. Something that involves experimental technology and puts my entire family at risk. There was a pause on the line, and when Jordan spoke again, his voice had taken on the cold, professional tone that Chris remembered from their military days. I'll have preliminary information to you by tonight. Full package within 72 hours. What else do you need? Clean identities for my family, if we need to disappear permanently, and access to some of the specialists you keep on retainer. Consider done. But Chris, Moore has serious resources and no moral limitations. If you're going up against him, you better be prepared to play by his rules. Chris looked up at the ceiling, where he could hear his children moving around as they started their day. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to protect my family. After ending the call, Chris returned his attention to Moore's psychological profile. The man was a classic narcissistic psychopath, intelligent, manipulative, and completely lacking in empathy. But he also had weaknesses that could be exploited. Moore's primary vulnerability was his ego. He saw himself as intellectually superior to everyone around him, which led him to overcomplicate his schemes and underestimate his opponents. He also had a pathological need for control, which meant he would struggle to adapt when his plans were disrupted. Chris began sketching the outline of his revenge plan. It would need to be multifaceted, hitting Moore's operations, his finances, his reputation, and his sense of personal security simultaneously. The goal wasn't just to stop Moore's surveillance of his family, but to destroy the man completely, ensuring he could never threaten anyone again. The plan would also need to account for Moore's government connections. The defense contractor had allies in various agencies who had benefited from his technology and information. Chris would need to isolate Moore from his support network before delivering the killing blow. As Jeanette and the children came downstairs for breakfast, Chris minimized the screens and tried to appear normal. But Emma, his perceptive 13-year-old, immediately noticed his tension. Dad, you look like you're planning a war, she said, settling down at the table with her cereal. Chris exchanged a look with Jeanette, who nodded slightly. Their daughter was old enough to understand that something serious was happening, and lying to her would only increase her anxiety. Emma, Jake, Chris said, his voice gentle but serious. Your mom and I need to tell you something important about why we're staying here for a while. Over the next half hour, Chris and Jeanette explained the situation in terms the children could understand. They focused on the surveillance aspect rather than the more sinister implications, but they made it clear that someone had violated their family's privacy and safety. So what are you going to do about it? Jake asked, his 10-year-old sense of justice clearly offended by the situation. I'm going to make sure this person can never hurt our family or anyone else's family ever again, Chris replied. Emma studied her father's face with the intensity that reminded him so much of her mother. You're going to fight back, aren't you? Like really fight back? Yes, Chris said simply. But I need you both to understand that this means we have to be very careful and very smart. We're dealing with someone dangerous, and the most important thing is keeping all of us safe. Both children nodded solemnly, and Chris felt a surge of pride at their maturity and resilience. They were Buchanans, and Buchanans didn't back down from fights that mattered. Later that afternoon, as the children played video games and Jeanette worked on her laptop, Chris received the first batch of intelligence from Jordan. Moore's operations were even more extensive than Chris had realized, with tentacles reaching into government agencies, private corporations, and criminal organizations across multiple countries. But the intelligence also revealed something else. Moore was vulnerable. His empire was built on secrecy and fear, and he had made numerous enemies over the years. Chris began to see how he could turn those enemies into allies, using Moore's own methods against him. The war was about to begin, and Christopher Buchanan intended to wage it with the same ruthless efficiency that had made him one of the military's top intelligence officers. Frederick Moore had awakened a sleeping dragon, and he was about to learn why that was a fatal mistake. Chapter 4. Building the Arsenal. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Denver had once housed Chris's security consulting firm's equipment storage, but now it served a darker purpose. Over the past week, it had become the staging ground for an operation that would have impressed his former military commanders with its scope and complexity. Jordan Eastman stood beside a table covered with surveillance equipment, weapons, and electronic devices, briefing Chris on the assets he had assembled. "I've got 6 specialists on standby," Jordan said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "Each one has a specific grudge against Moore or his organization." The team Jordan had assembled was a carefully curated collection of individuals whose lives had been disrupted or destroyed by Frederick Moore's operations. There was Wayne Peterson, a former NSA analyst who had been blacklisted after refusing to cooperate with one of Moore's illegal data harvesting schemes. Danny Gay was an ex-CIA operative whose family had been killed in a terrorist attack that Danny was convinced was actually a Moore-sponsored false flag operation designed to justify increased surveillance funding. "Moore doesn't just make enemies," Jordan explained. "He creates people who have nothing left to lose. That makes them incredibly dangerous to him." Chris studied the dossiers of each team member, impressed by Jordan's recruitment strategy. Rather than hiring random mercenaries, he had found people with personal vendettas against Moore, individuals who would fight with the dedication of true believers rather than mere employees. "What about his security?" Chris asked, examining the architectural plans of Moore's primary residence and corporate headquarters. "Extensive, but predictable," Wayne Peterson spoke up, his voice carrying the analytical precision of his NSA background. "Moore relies heavily on electronic surveillance and automated systems. He's overconfident in his technology, which creates vulnerabilities." Wayne had been mapping Moore's security networks for the past 3 days, identifying weak points and potential entry vectors. "The man who built his fortune on surveillance has a blind spot when it comes to human intelligence and social engineering." Chris nodded, recognizing the tactical opportunity. Moore's reliance on technology meant he would be vulnerable to attacks that exploited human psychology and social manipulation, areas where Chris excelled. "What's our financial situation?" Chris asked, knowing that an operation of this scope would require substantial resources. Jordan smiled grimly. Moore made another mistake when he started this war. 3 years ago, he tried to muscle in on some contracts that belonged to people I know. They've been looking for payback ever since, and they're willing to finance our operation. The funding was coming from a consortium of defense contractors and private military companies that had been victimized by Moore's predatory business practices. They were providing not just money, but access to specialized equipment and intelligence that would be crucial to the operation's success. "We have a budget of $2 million in access to military-grade surveillance and communication equipment," Jordan continued. "We also have friends in several government agencies who are tired of Moore's influence and are willing to look the other way when we make our move." Chris felt a familiar surge of excitement that he remembered from his military planning days. The pieces were falling into place, and he could see how the operation would unfold across multiple phases. "Phase 1 is intelligence, gathering, and preparation," Chris explained to the team. "We need complete situational awareness of Moore's operations, his personnel, his routines, and his security measures. Wayne, I want you coordinating electronic surveillance and data analysis." "Phase 2 is isolation," Chris continued, pointing to a whiteboard where he had begun mapping Moore's network of allies and resources. "We need to systematically undermine his support structure, his political connections, his business relationships, his sources of protection." Danny Gay leaned forward, his eyes bright with anticipation. "And Phase 3? Phase 3 is the reckoning," Chris said simply. "We destroy Moore completely, his business, his reputation, his freedom, and his ability to ever threaten innocent people again." The room fell silent as the team absorbed the implications of what Chris was proposing. This wasn't just about stopping Moore's surveillance operation or protecting Chris's family. This was about completely dismantling a criminal empire that had operated with impunity for decades. "What about collateral damage?" asked Leah Pennington, a former military contractor who specialized in psychological operations. "Moore has hundreds of employees, many of whom are probably innocent." Chris had been anticipating this question. "We target the leadership and the core criminal operations. Innocent employees will be given opportunities to distance themselves before we strike. But anyone who knowingly participates in human experimentation or illegal surveillance activities is fair game." Over the next several hours, the team refined their operational plan. They would begin with passive surveillance, mapping Moore's daily routines and identifying vulnerabilities in his security. Simultaneously, they would start a campaign of economic warfare, using insider information to attack his business interests and financial resources. The psychological warfare component would be crucial. Chris knew that Moore's narcissistic personality meant he would become increasingly reckless as he felt his control slipping. The key was to apply pressure gradually, making Moore react emotionally rather than strategically. "What about your family?" Jordan asked as the briefing concluded. "They'll need to remain hidden until this is over." Chris had already made arrangements. His children were enrolled in a private school under assumed names, and Jeanette was working remotely under a new identity. The cabin remained their base, but Chris had established several backup locations in case they needed to relocate quickly. "They're protected and prepared," Chris replied. "Jeanette understands what we're doing and why it's necessary. The kids think this is an extended adventure. I intend to keep it that way." As the team dispersed to begin their preparations, Chris remained in the warehouse, studying satellite photos of Moore's compound. The man who had violated his wife and threatened his family was about to learn what it meant to face an opponent who combined military training, intelligence experience, and a desperate motivation of a father protecting his children. Chris pulled out his secure phone and sent a brief, encrypted message to Jeanette. "The hunt begins tomorrow. I love you." Her response came back almost immediately. "Bring them down, soldier. We're proud of you." Christopher Buchanan smiled grimly as he turned off the lights in the warehouse. Frederick Moore had started a war against the wrong family, and now he was about to discover just how expensive that mistake would be. Chapter 5: The First Strike. The Nexus Dynamics corporate headquarters in downtown Denver was a gleaming 40-story monument to Frederick Moore's technological empire. But at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning, it became ground zero for Chris's opening salvo in their private war. Wayne Peterson's fingers flew across multiple keyboards in the back of a modified van parked 6 blocks from the building. "I'm inside their primary server," he reported through his headset. "Their security is impressive, but they made the classic mistake of trusting their own technology too much." Chris watched from a rooftop across the street as Danny Gay and 2 other team members moved through the building's lower levels. They had gained access through a maintenance tunnel that Wayne had identified in the building's architectural plans, a vulnerability that existed precisely because Moore's security focused on high-tech solutions rather than basic physical security. "Package delivered." Danny's voice crackled through the comm system. 20 minutes to showtime." The package was a collection of devices that would simultaneously disrupt Moore's surveillance network and plant evidence of his illegal activities in locations where federal investigators would be certain to find it. Chris had spent weeks studying Moore's psychological profile, and he knew the man would respond to this attack with predictable arrogance and escalation. "Wayne, initiate Phase 1 Alpha," Chris commanded, watching through his binoculars as lights began flickering throughout the Nexus building. What followed was a precisely choreographed technological assault. Wayne systematically crashed Moore's surveillance systems while simultaneously uploading terabytes of data to secure servers. The data included evidence of Moore's human experimentation programs, financial records showing illegal government contracts, and most damning of all, recordings of Moore discussing the elimination of problematic test subjects. But Chris's masterstroke was more subtle. Hidden within the legitimate evidence were carefully crafted pieces of disinformation designed to make Moore believe that several of his closest associates were betraying him. Chris knew that Moore's paranoid personality would lead him to turn on his own allies fracturing his organization from within. The psychological warfare component was already beginning. For the past week, Moore's employees had been receiving anonymous emails containing evidence of their boss's illegal activities. Many of them were already contacting lawyers and federal agents, seeking immunity deals in exchange for their cooperation. Building secure, Danny reported. All personnel evacuated through the emergency protocols. No casualties, no witnesses. Chris nodded, satisfied with the first phase's execution. All teams, exfiltrate to Rally Point Alpha. Phase 1 Bravo initiates in 6 hours. As the team withdrew from the area, Chris remained on the rooftop, watching as federal agents began arriving at the Nexus building. Wayne's handiwork had triggered automatic alerts to multiple government agencies, ensuring that Moore's illegal activities would be investigated simultaneously by the FBI, DEA, and several military intelligence units. But the real genius of the plan was its timing. Moore was currently attending a defense contractors conference in Washington, D.C., surrounded by government officials and potential allies. The raid on his headquarters would force him to choose between maintaining his public image and rushing back to Denver to handle the crisis personally. Chris's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from one of Jordan's contacts in the FBI. Package received. Authorization granted for full investigation. Your intel is solid gold. Phase 1 Bravo began at 9:30 a.m., just as Moore was scheduled to give a keynote presentation to a group of Pentagon officials. Chris watched the live stream from his laptop as Moore took the stage, completely unaware that his world was collapsing in real time. The presentation lasted exactly 12 minutes before Moore's assistant rushed onto the stage and whispered urgently in his ear. Chris watched with satisfaction as Moore's face went pale, then flushed with anger, as he processed the information about the raid on his headquarters. Moore made his first critical error at that moment. Instead of handling the crisis with calm professionalism, he stormed off the stage and began making increasingly frantic phone calls. The defense officials in attendance noted his loss of composure, and several contracts that had been under consideration were quietly withdrawn. He's taking the bait, Jordan reported from his observation post outside Moore's D.C. hotel. 3 black SUVs just left for the airport. He's coming home. Chris smiled grimly. Moore's predictable response was playing directly into the trap. By rushing back to Denver in a panic, he was abandoning his political allies and isolating himself exactly where Chris wanted him. But Moore's return journey became an additional opportunity for psychological warfare. During his flight, Moore discovered that his corporate accounts had been frozen by federal investigators. His personal communications were being monitored, and several of his key employees had been arrested on charges ranging from conspiracy to human rights violations. The most devastating blow came when Moore landed at Denver International Airport and discovered that his own security team had been compromised. 3 of his bodyguards were arrested on outstanding warrants that Wayne had arranged to be activated, while 2 others simply failed to show up for duty, a result of Danny's persuasive conversations about the legal consequences of protecting a wanted criminal. He's isolated, angry, and making emotional decisions, Chris reported to his team as they prepared for Phase 2. Textbook psychological breakdown of a narcissistic personality under pressure. But Chris knew that Moore was still dangerous, perhaps more so now that he was desperate. The next phase of the plan would require careful timing and precise execution, because a cornered enemy with Moore's resources could still inflict significant damage. As Chris drove back to the warehouse to brief his team on Phase 2, he reflected on how perfectly the opening gambit had unfolded. In less than 24 hours, they had crippled Moore's surveillance network, triggered federal investigations that would occupy his attention and resources, and isolated him from his support structure. More importantly, they had forced Moore to react rather than act, putting Chris's team in control of the tempo and direction of their conflict. The man who had built his empire on patient manipulation and careful planning was now operating in crisis mode, making the kinds of mistakes that Chris could exploit. Chris's secure phone buzzed with a message from Jeanette. Saw the news about Nexus Dynamics. Are you okay? His response was brief, but filled with satisfaction. Phase 1 complete. Our family will be safe soon. Frederick Moore had started this war by violating Chris's family with his surveillance technology. Now Chris was systematically dismantling Moore's life using the same methodical precision that had made him one of the military's top intelligence officers. The hunter had become the hunted, and Moore was about to learn what it felt like to be prey. Chapter 6. The Trap Springs Shut. The emergency meeting at Moore's private estate in Aspen represented exactly the kind of tactical mistake that Chris had been hoping to provoke. Desperate to regain control of his collapsing empire, Moore had summoned his remaining loyal associates to his most secure location, a decision that would prove to be his downfall. Chris studied the estate through high-powered binoculars from a concealed position on the adjacent mountainside. The sprawling compound was a testament to Moore's paranoia, featuring multiple security perimeters, armed guards, and surveillance systems that would have impressed a government installation. 17 personnel confirmed on-site, Wayne Peterson reported from his mobile command center, including Moore, his personal security team, and 6 key operational leaders. This is everyone we've been trying to get close to for weeks. The beauty of Chris's strategy was that Moore's paranoid personality had led him to gather all his most valuable targets in a single location, believing his estate's security made him invulnerable. But Chris had spent the past month studying the compound's weaknesses, and he had identified several vulnerabilities that Moore's overconfidence had created. Phase 2 Alpha is go, Chris commanded, watching as Danny Gay and his infiltration team began their approach through the estate's blind spots. Remember, we need them alive and talking. The plan required perfect timing and coordination. While Danny's team neutralized the external security, Wayne would crash the compound's electronic systems, cutting off Moore's communications and trapping the conspirators inside their own fortress. But the most crucial element was the psychological component. Chris had arranged for Moore to receive a series of messages that would convince him that the attack was coming from his former government allies, who had decided to eliminate him as a liability. The goal was to make Moore believe that his own paranoid worldview was correct, that everyone around him was betraying him. Perimeter security neutralized, Danny reported, his voice calm and professional despite the complexity of the operation. Moving to Phase 2 Bravo. Chris watched through his binoculars as the compound's lights flickered and died, leaving the estate in darkness except for emergency lighting. Wayne's electronic warfare had been perfectly executed, creating confusion and panic among Moore's team while preserving the compound's internal surveillance systems for Chris's use. The next 30 minutes unfolded with military precision. Danny's team systematically captured Moore's associates, using non-lethal methods that left them conscious but immobilized. Each capture was recorded by the compound's own security cameras, creating evidence that would be invaluable in the coming legal proceedings. Moore himself was the final target, found barricaded in his secure communications room, frantically trying to contact his government allies for rescue. Chris's psychological warfare had been successful. Moore genuinely believed that he was being eliminated by his former partners rather than hunted by the family he had violated. Package secured, Danny reported as his team extracted Moore from the communications room. Subject is conscious and cooperative. Chris made his way down the mountainside to the compound, his heart pounding with anticipation. After months of planning and execution, he was finally face-to-face with the man who had threatened his family. Moore was secured in his own conference room, surrounded by evidence of his crimes that Chris's team had carefully arranged for maximum psychological impact. The man who had once seemed so powerful and threatening now appeared small and pathetic, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face pale with fear. "Frederick Moore," Chris said as he entered the room, noting how Moore's eyes widened with recognition. "I don't think we were ever formally introduced." Christopher Buchanan, military intelligence, retired. Moore's composure cracked completely. You're the bastard who tried to destroy my operation in Eastern Europe." Chris smiled coldly. "I didn't try to destroy it. I'm going to succeed this time. You made a critical error when you decided to use my wife as a test subject for your surveillance technology." "Your wife?" Moore's confusion was genuine. "That was just random selection for product testing. She wasn't. I didn't know. Chris felt a surge of anger at Moore's casual dismissal of the violation he had inflicted on Jeanette. You implanted surveillance devices in my wife's eyes without her knowledge or consent. You turned her into an unwitting spy against her own family. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? Moore's expression shifted from confusion to calculation as he began to understand the scope of Chris's revenge operation. The federal raids, the financial attacks, the systematic destruction of my network. That was all you? That was just the beginning, Chris replied. Wayne, show Mr. Moore what we've prepared for the finale. Wayne activated a large monitor in the conference room, displaying a comprehensive presentation of evidence that would be released simultaneously to multiple media outlets, government agencies, and international human rights organizations. The evidence included not just Moore's recent activities, but decades of crimes that Chris's team had uncovered during their investigation. Everything, Chris said, watching Moore's face as he processed the scope of the evidence against him. Every illegal experiment, every murdered witness, every government official you've bribed, every family you've destroyed. All of it will be released unless you cooperate fully with authorities and make full restitution to your victims. Moore's psychological breakdown accelerated as he realized the impossibility of his situation. You can't prove half of this. My government connections will protect me. Your government connections are already distancing themselves from you, Chris replied. 3 of your Pentagon contacts were arrested this morning. 2 senators have called for investigations into your contracts. And your CIA liaison has been reassigned to a desk job in Alaska. Chris pulled out a legal document that had been prepared by attorneys working with the victims' families. You have a choice, Frederick. You can cooperate with authorities, plead guilty to the charges against you, and serve your time in a minimum security federal prison. Or you can fight this in court and spend the rest of your life in a maximum security facility after every detail of your crimes becomes public knowledge. Moore stared at the document, his hands trembling as he began to understand that his empire was truly finished. What about my family? My children? Chris felt a moment of sympathy, remembering his own children who were still living under assumed names in a safe house. But then he thought of Jeanette's violated eyes and the dozens of other victims who had suffered under Moore's experiments. Your family will be protected and provided for, but they'll also live with the knowledge of what you've done. That's more consideration than you showed my family or any of your other victims. The document Moore signed that night was comprehensive and devastating. In exchange for protective custody and a reduced sentence, he provided complete testimony about his illegal activities, named his co-conspirators, and agreed to forfeit his assets to a victim compensation fund. As federal agents arrived to take Moore into custody, Chris stepped outside the compound and called Jeanette on his secure phone. It's over, he said simply. He's in custody. His organization is destroyed, and the surveillance devices will be removed from your eyes within the week. Jeanette's relief was audible even through the encrypted connection. Are we safe? Can we go home? Chris looked back at the compound where Frederick Moore was being led away in handcuffs, his criminal empire reduced to boxes of evidence and testimony that would keep prosecutors busy for years. We're safe, he confirmed. The threat is neutralized, and there's no one left to come after us. We can go home. As Chris drove away from the compound, he reflected on the completeness of his victory. Moore's organization had been dismantled, his co-conspirators were facing prosecution, and his victims would receive both justice and compensation. Most importantly, no family would ever again suffer the violation that Moore had inflicted on the Buchanans. The hunter had successfully become the hunted, and Christopher Buchanan had proven that some enemies should never underestimate the determination of a father protecting his family. Chapter 7. Reckoning. 3 weeks after Moore's arrest, Chris sat in the sterile white room of the Colorado Medical Center, holding Jeanette's hand as Dr. Elena Chung prepared to remove the surveillance devices from her eyes. The procedure was delicate but routine. Dr. Chung was one of the world's leading experts in ocular nanotechnology, and she had successfully removed similar devices from 7 other victims of Moore's experiments. The good news is that there appears to be no permanent damage, Dr. Chung explained as she reviewed the latest scans. Moore's technology was sophisticated, but it was designed to be reversible. He apparently wanted to be able to extract his devices if necessary. Chris squeezed Jeanette's hand, feeling a complex mixture of relief and lingering anger. The physical violation could be repaired, but the psychological impact of knowing their privacy had been invaded so completely would take longer to heal. How many others were there? Jeanette asked, though Chris could tell she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. 43 confirmed cases, Dr. Chung replied. Moore had been testing his technology for over 2 years, using it to gather intelligence on government officials, business competitors, and law enforcement personnel. Your husband's investigation exposed the largest domestic surveillance conspiracy in U.S. history. The scope of Moore's operation had become clear during his debriefing with federal authorities. The surveillance network had extended far beyond simple espionage. Moore had been selling access to his unwitting test subjects to foreign intelligence agencies, criminal organizations, and anyone willing to pay for intimate access to their targets' lives. The federal prosecutor wants to meet with us next week, Chris said, having received the call that morning. Moore's plea agreement includes full cooperation, but they want our testimony to ensure the case against his co-conspirators is airtight. The legal proceedings were already generating national headlines. Moore's confession had implicated dozens of government officials, corporate executives, and foreign agents in a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of American society. Congressional hearings were scheduled, and several cabinet-level officials had already resigned rather than face investigation. But for Chris, the most satisfying aspect of the aftermath was watching Moore's psychological disintegration during his imprisonment. The man who had built his identity around control and manipulation was now confined to a small cell, facing the rest of his life behind bars while his former victims testified about the horrors he had inflicted on them. Dr. Chung, Chris said as the surgeon prepared her instruments, I want to watch the procedure. I need to see these things being removed from my wife's eyes. Dr. Chung nodded understandingly. Many of the family members have requested the same thing. It provides closure to actually witness the violation being undone. The procedure took 90 minutes, during which Chris watched with grim fascination as the microscopic devices were carefully extracted from Jeanette's retinal tissue. Each device was no larger than a grain of sand, but together they had formed a sophisticated surveillance network that had transmitted every visual detail of their lives to Moore's monitoring stations. There, Dr. Chung said as she removed the final device. That's the last one. Mrs. Buchanan, you're officially free of Frederick Moore's invasion of your privacy. Jeanette's eyes were bandaged for the recovery period, but Chris could see the tension leaving her body as she processed the reality that the surveillance was finally over. I can't believe something so small could cause so much terror and disruption in our lives. That was exactly Moore's intention, Chris replied. He wanted his victims to feel helpless and violated. The technology wasn't just about surveillance. It was about psychological control. Later that evening, as Jeanette rested at the cabin with her eyes protected, Chris received a call from Jordan Eastman with an update on the cleanup operations. Moore's remaining associates are either in custody or cooperating with authorities, Jordan reported. The whole network has collapsed. Wayne estimates it'll take investigators about 5 years to fully document all the crimes they committed. Chris felt a deep sense of satisfaction at the thoroughness of their victory. What about the international connections? Interpol has issued warrants for 12 foreign operatives who were buying intelligence from Moore. 3 governments have launched their own investigations into officials who were compromised by his surveillance network. This thing is going global. The international ramifications were still unfolding. More surveillance data had been used to blackmail foreign officials, manipulate business transactions, and even influence political elections in several countries. The diplomatic consequences would likely continue for years. The kids are asking when they can go back to their regular school, Chris said, thinking of Emma and Jake, who were still living under their assumed identities. Give it another month, Jordan advised. We want to be absolutely certain that all of Moore's associates are accounted for before we expose your family to any potential retaliation. Chris understood the caution, but he was eager for his family to return to normal life. The past months have been a testament to their resilience, but Emma and Jake deserve to be children again, not refugees from their father's war against a criminal conspiracy. The next morning brought news that provided Chris with perfect closure to the Moore saga. His former adversary had attempted suicide in his federal holding cell, but had been unsuccessful due to the careful monitoring of high-value prisoners. Moore would live to serve his full sentence, a minimum of 45 years without possibility of parole. He tried to take the easy way out, Chris told Jeanette as he read her the news report. But he doesn't get to escape that easily. He'll spend the rest of his life knowing that his victims survived and thrived while his empire crumbled to dust. Dr. Chung called that afternoon with news that Jeanette's recovery was proceeding perfectly. The removal sites were healing without complications, and her vision would be completely normal within another week. There's something else, Dr. Chung added. The devices we removed from your wife were more sophisticated than the ones we've seen in other victims. Moore was using her as a test subject for his most advanced surveillance technology. Chris felt his anger flare again at the reminder of how specifically his family had been targeted. What makes them different? These devices could not only record visual information, but they could also influence what the subject saw. Moore could have made your wife see things that weren't there, or prevented her from seeing things that were. He was essentially developing technology for reality manipulation. The implications were chilling. Moore hadn't just been spying on their family. He had been preparing to psychologically manipulate Jeanette's perception of reality. The violation was even deeper than Chris had realized. But the knowledge also confirmed that Chris's decision to completely destroy Moore rather than simply stopping his surveillance activities had been correct. A man with such technology and such complete disregard for human dignity could never be allowed to operate freely again. That evening, Chris stood on the cabin's deck, looking out at the mountains and reflecting on the transformation his family had undergone. They had entered this ordeal as victims of a sophisticated surveillance conspiracy, but they had emerged stronger, closer, and with a deep appreciation for their privacy and autonomy. Emma and Jake were playing video games inside, their laughter carrying through the open windows. Jeanette was reading beside the fireplace, her unbandaged eyes focusing perfectly on the pages. The normalcy of the scene was a testament to their victory over Moore's attempt to control and manipulate their lives. Christopher Buchanan had achieved something that few people ever experience: complete and total victory over an enemy who had threatened everything he held dear. Moore's empire was destroyed, his co-conspirators were facing justice, and his victims were healing from their trauma. Most importantly, the Buchanan family was safe, whole, and free to live their lives without the shadow of unwanted surveillance hanging over them. The war was over, and they had won decisively. Chapter 8. Justice Served. The federal courthouse in Denver had never seen a case quite like United States versus Frederick Moore. The proceedings had attracted national media attention, with reporters from major networks lining the courthouse steps as Chris and Jeanette arrived to give their victim impact statements. Inside the packed courtroom, Moore sat at the defendant's table looking like a broken man. His expensive suits had been replaced with orange prison garb, and his once commanding presence had been reduced to the nervous fidgeting of someone facing life imprisonment. The psychological warfare that Chris had waged against him had taken its toll. Moore's hair had gone completely gray, and he appeared to have aged decades in the months since his arrest. Your Honor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Amber McDonald began her presentation. The defendant orchestrated the most extensive domestic surveillance conspiracy in American history. Over 43 innocent civilians were subjected to illegal human experimentation, their most intimate moments recorded and sold to foreign intelligence agencies. Chris listened as the prosecutor detailed the full scope of Moore's crimes. The surveillance network had extended far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. Moore had been testing his technology on everyone from local politicians to federal judges, creating a web of blackmail and manipulation that had influenced dozens of important decisions over the past 2 years. When it was Chris's turn to speak, he stood and faced Moore directly, wanting the man to see the strength and determination of the family he had tried to destroy. Your Honor, Frederick Moore didn't just violate my family's privacy, Chris began, his voice carrying the authority he had learned during his military service. He turned my wife into an unwitting spy against her own children. He recorded our most intimate family moments and sold that information to anyone willing to pay for it. Chris detailed how Moore's surveillance had captured everything from family dinners to private conversations between parents and children. The psychological violation extended far beyond the physical implants. It had infected every memory of their family life with the knowledge that they had never truly been alone. But this case isn't just about my family, Chris continued. Moore's technology represented a fundamental threat to human autonomy and dignity. He was developing the capability to not just watch his victims, but to manipulate their perception of reality itself. If this conspiracy had continued, it could have fundamentally altered the nature of human consciousness and free will. Jeanette's testimony was even more powerful. She described the moment she learned that her own eyes had been turned against her family, and the months of recovery required to feel safe in her own home again. I keep thinking about all the times I looked at my children and didn't know that their images were being transmitted to strangers, Jeanette said, her voice steady but filled with controlled emotion. Every bedtime story, every homework session, every private moment between a mother and her children was being recorded and analyzed by people who saw us as nothing more than test subjects. The testimony of other victims filled 2 entire days. Government officials described how Moore's surveillance had influenced their decisions on defense contracts and policy initiatives. Corporate executives detailed how their business strategies had been compromised and sold to competitors. Families recounted the psychological trauma of learning that their most private moments had been commodified and distributed to criminal organizations. But perhaps the most damning testimony came from Moore's former associates, who had agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for reduced sentences. They painted a picture of a man so consumed with power and control that he had lost all sense of moral boundaries. Moore used to say that privacy was just an outdated concept, testified Wayne's counterpart from Moore's organization, a former NSA analyst named Justin Medina. He believed that people would eventually accept total surveillance as the price of security. He saw himself as accelerating that inevitable future. The defense attempted to portray Moore as a patriotic businessman whose methods had been extreme, but whose goals have been legitimate national security objectives. But the evidence of his commercial exploitation of the surveillance data, combined with his willingness to sell American intelligence to foreign governments, made that argument impossible to sustain. Judge Terrence Mills had presided over federal courts for 23 years, but even he seemed shaken by the scope of Moore's crimes. "Mr. Moore," the judge said as he prepared to deliver the sentence, "you have violated the most fundamental privacy rights of American citizens in pursuit of personal profit and power. Your actions represent a betrayal not just of your victims, but of the constitutional principles that define our democracy." The sentence was comprehensive and devastating. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole on the surveillance conspiracy charges, plus consecutive sentences for human rights violations, racketeering, and treason. Moore would spend the rest of his life in the maximum security federal penitentiary in Colorado, with no possibility of ever regaining his freedom. But the sentence extended beyond Moore himself. His co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years, and his corporate assets were liquidated to establish a victim compensation fund that would provide ongoing medical care and financial support for everyone who had been subjected to his surveillance technology. The international ramifications continued to unfold even after the sentencing. 3 foreign intelligence agencies were exposed as having purchased data from Moore's network, leading to diplomatic crises and the expulsion of dozens of intelligence operatives from the United States. The technology Moore had developed was classified and secured by U.S. military intelligence, ensuring that it could never again be used for illegal surveillance purposes. As Chris and Jeanette left the courthouse, they were approached by Dr. Ted Ramsey, the optometrist whose courage in reporting the surveillance devices had made the entire investigation possible. "I want to thank you for seeing this through," Dr. Ramsey said, shaking Chris's hand. When I first saw those devices in your wife's eyes, I wasn't sure anyone would believe me or take action. You saved our family and dozens of other families, Chris replied. Your decision to speak up instead of staying silent took real courage. Dr. Ramsey smiled, but his expression remained serious. I keep thinking about how many other victims there might be out there, people who were subjected to Moore's experiments but haven't been identified yet. This case has shown us that the technology exists and that there are people willing to use it. Chris nodded, understanding the broader implications of what they had uncovered. Moore's conspiracy had been stopped, but the technology and the temptation to abuse it would continue to exist. Vigilance would be required to prevent future violations of human privacy and dignity. That evening, Chris and Jeanette returned to their original home for the first time in months. The house felt both familiar and strange. They knew intellectually that it was safe, but would take time for them to fully trust their privacy again. Emma and Jake were excited to return to their regular school and resume their normal activities. The children had adapted remarkably well to their extended adventure, but Chris could see their relief at returning to predictable routines and familiar surroundings. "Dad," Emma said as the family sat down for their first dinner in their original dining room, "are you proud of what you did to that bad man?" Chris considered the question carefully. "I'm proud that we protected our family and stopped him from hurting other families. I'm proud that justice was served and that his victims received compensation for what they suffered." "But," Emma pressed, reading the complexity in her father's tone. "But I also hope that we never have to go through something like this again," Chris replied. "Fighting back was necessary, but it required us to become harder and more suspicious than I would have preferred. I hope you and Jake can grow up in a world where such vigilance isn't necessary." Jake, ever practical, asked, "Are there other bad guys out there like Mr. Moore?" Chris exchanged a look with Jeanette, both of them understanding that their children deserved an honest answer. "There probably are," Chris said, "but now there are also people watching for them, and laws that make it harder for them to hurt innocent families. The most important thing is that we stay together and look out for each other." As the family settled into their restored normal life, Chris reflected on the completeness of their victory over Frederick Moore. The man who had violated their privacy was spending the rest of his life in prison. His co-conspirators were facing similar fates. His victims were receiving justice and compensation. And most importantly, his surveillance technology had been secured and could never again be used against innocent people. Christopher Buchanan had proven that even the most sophisticated and well-connected enemies could be defeated by someone with the right combination of skills, determination, and moral clarity. The war was over, justice had been served, and the Buchanan family was finally, truly safe. Chapter 9. New Beginnings. 6 months after Frederick Moore's sentencing, Chris stood in the backyard of their Denver home, watching Emma and Jake play with their friends in what had become a regular Saturday afternoon gathering. The children's laughter echoed across the neighborhood, a sound that represented everything Moore's surveillance conspiracy had threatened to steal from their family. Jeanette emerged from the house carrying a tray of drinks for their guests, Dr. Ted Ramsey and his family, Jordan Eastman with his wife and children, and several other families who had been victimized by Moore's surveillance network. What had begun as a support group for recovering victims had evolved into genuine friendships forged through shared trauma and mutual assistance. "Hard to believe it's been a year since this all started," Dr. Ramsey commented, settling into one of the patio chairs Chris had arranged for their gathering. Chris nodded, reflecting on how much their lives had changed since that fateful day in the optometrist's office. "Sometimes it feels like it happened to different people. The family that walked into your clinic that day was naive about the threats that exist in our technological world. The past months had brought unexpected opportunities along with healing." Chris's expertise in counter-surveillance and his role in exposing Moore's conspiracy had attracted attention from government agencies and private security firms. He had been consulted on several high-profile cases involving illegal surveillance, and his security consulting business had grown exponentially. But more importantly, Chris had discovered a calling that extended beyond personal protection. He was working with congressional committees to draft legislation that would prevent future surveillance abuses, and he had established a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping victims of illegal technological experimentation. The Buchanan Foundation has already helped 37 families, Jeanette said, settling beside her husband with a satisfaction that came from turning their trauma into a force for protecting others. We've got enough funding to provide legal assistance and medical care for surveillance victims for the next 5 years. The foundation's work had revealed the true scope of technological privacy violations in American society. Moore's conspiracy had been exceptional in its sophistication and scale, but similar abuses were occurring across the country as surveillance technology advanced faster than the legal frameworks designed to control it. Jordan Eastman, who had become the foundation's head of security, provided regular updates on their expanding mission. We've identified 12 other companies that were potentially using similar surveillance technologies, he reported. None as advanced as Moore's operation, but still concerning enough to warrant investigation. The work was challenging, but deeply fulfilling. Chris had found that his military intelligence background and his experience defeating Moore's conspiracy made him uniquely qualified to identify and counter surveillance threats that law enforcement agencies struggled to understand. Emma's Science Fair project won second place, Jeanette announced, drawing Chris's attention back to their family's current achievements. She did a presentation on privacy rights and surveillance technology. Her teacher said it was the most sophisticated analysis she'd ever seen from a middle school student. Chris smiled, remembering Emma's determination to understand what had happened to their family. Both children had been affected by their experience, but in ways that seemed to strengthen rather than traumatize them. Emma had developed an interest in technology and civil liberties, while Jake had become fascinated with security systems and protective measures. "What about the book project?" Dr. Ramsey asked, referring to the memoir Chris had been writing about their experience with Moore's surveillance conspiracy. "Publisher says it'll be out next spring," Chris replied. "We're hoping it'll help people understand the threats that exist and the importance of maintaining privacy rights in a technological society." The book had been therapeutic to write, allowing Chris to process the full scope of what their family had endured and accomplished. But it also served a larger purpose, educating the public about surveillance threats and providing a blueprint for fighting back against technological abuse. The legal aftermath of Moore's case continued to generate headlines. 3 more co-conspirators had been sentenced in the past month, and congressional hearings were still ongoing. The case had become a watershed moment in privacy law, establishing precedents that would protect future victims of surveillance technology. "Any word on Moore himself?" Jordan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would. Chris's expression hardened slightly. "He's in solitary confinement at ADX Florence. Attempted to organize a smuggling operation from prison, trying to get surveillance devices to other inmates. Even behind bars, he can't stop trying to violate people's privacy." The news of Moore's continued criminal activities had reinforced Chris's conviction that destroying the man completely had been the correct decision. Moore was a predator who would never voluntarily stop victimizing others, and only permanent incarceration could protect society from his schemes. But Chris had also learned to separate his satisfaction with Moore's punishment from his family's healing process. The children rarely asked about Moore anymore, and Jeanette had stopped having nightmares about being watched. Their lives had moved beyond the trauma of surveillance and into a future defined by their own choices rather than Moore's violations. "Dad," Emma called from the yard, "can you help us with the security system for our treehouse?" Chris laughed, recognizing the irony of his daughter's request. The girl who had been victimized by surveillance technology was now enthusiastically embracing protective technology as a tool for maintaining her own privacy and security. "Sure thing, kiddo," Chris replied, standing to join the children in their project. As he walked across the yard, Chris reflected on the completeness of their family's transformation. They had entered the conflict with Moore's victims, but they had emerged as protectors, not just of themselves, but of other families facing similar threats. The children's treehouse had become a symbol of their recovered sense of security and privacy. It was their space, protected by systems they understood and controlled, where they could be children without fear of unwanted observation or interference. Later that evening, after their guests had departed and the children were asleep, Chris and Jeanette sat on their back porch, enjoying the quiet comfort of their restored privacy. "Do you ever regret how we handled the Moore situation?" Jeanette asked, a question that had occasionally surfaced during their recovery process. Chris considered his response carefully. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that our children had to experience that kind of threat and upheaval. But I don't regret our decision to fight back completely and decisively. Even the illegal parts?" Jeanette pressed gently. Chris nodded without hesitation. "Especially the illegal parts. Moore was operating outside the law, and conventional legal remedies would have taken years to implement while he continued victimizing other families. Sometimes justice requires people to act outside normal channels." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the normal sounds of their neighborhood: traffic, distant conversations, dogs barking. These were the sounds of a free society, where people could move and speak and live without fear of comprehensive surveillance. "The foundation received another donation today," Jeanette mentioned. "Anonymous, but substantial. Someone out there understands what we're trying to accomplish." Chris suspected the donation had come from one of the government agencies that had benefited from his expertise in dismantling Moore's network, but he didn't pursue the question. The important thing was that their work would continue, protecting other families from the kind of technological abuse they had experienced. As they prepared for bed, Chris checked the discrete security systems he had installed throughout their home. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were using surveillance technology to protect themselves from surveillance technology. But the crucial difference was consent and control. These were their systems, operated according to their values, protecting their privacy rather than violating it. "I love you, soldier," Jeanette said as they settled into bed, using the affectionate term she had adopted during their conflict with Moore. "I love you too," Chris replied, holding his wife close and marveling at how completely they had reclaimed their sense of security and intimacy. Outside their bedroom window, the city of Denver stretched into the distance. Millions of people living their lives with the assumption that their privacy was protected by law and social convention. Thanks to the exposure of Moore's conspiracy and the legal precedents established by his prosecution, that assumption was now more secure than it had been in decades. Christopher Buchanan had begun this journey as a victim of surveillance technology, but he had